In 1990, one of the most celebrated actresses in Hollywood history lay dying in a Santa Monica hospital.
Oh, excuse me.
She had made 84 films. She had earned 4 Academy Award nominations. She had been called the greatest actress of her generation by directors who had worked with everyone. She was, by every professional measure, a legend. Her son wanted to see her one
We have
last
met
time.
before.
She left instructions with her doctors, explicit, final, if impossible to understand, that he was not to be allowed into her room under any circumstances. He never got to say goodbye. Anthony Dion Fay had spent his entire life trying to be loved by Barbara Stanwyck. He had been adopted when he was 10 months old. He had grown up in her house, eaten at her table, carried her last name, and he had also been sent away to boarding schools, to summer camps, to military school, moved further and further to the edges of her life until the distance between them was so total that her dying wish was that he not be permitted to cross it. A film critic once wrote that Dion and his mother had something in common. Both of them were effectively orphans. He was not wrong. This is the story of Barbara Stanwyck. Where she came from, what it cost her, and the son whose life was shaped by a love she could never find her way to giving. Her name was not Barbara Stanwyck. She was born Ruby Catherine Stevens on July 16, 1907, in Brooklyn, New York. She was the fifth child of Byron Stevens, a bricklayer, and his wife Catherine, a working-class family living in the specific way of working-class Brooklyn families in the early 20th century, which is to say...
There's a speed limit in this state, Mr. Neff. 45 miles an hour.
Things went wrong immediately. When Ruby was 4 years old, her mother Catherine was standing on a moving streetcar when someone pushed her. She fell. She did not survive. Her father Byron, stricken with a grief he had no tools to manage and 5 children he had no means to raise alone, did what men of his era and his circumstances sometimes did. He left. He did not say goodbye. He did not arrange for the children's care. He simply was there one day and gone the next, vanished into the city, leaving 5 children behind him like objects he had set down and forgotten. Ruby Stevens was 4 years old, both parents gone within weeks of each other. She had not done anything to cause this. She was 4 years old. Her older sister Mildred, who was 9, tried to hold the family together. She couldn't. The children were distributed to relatives and neighbors and eventually to foster homes. Ruby moved through a series of households in Brooklyn, sleeping on kitchen floors, eating whatever was available, raising herself in the specific way that children raise themselves when no adult has accepted the responsibility. "Where I grew up," she said decades later, "kids lived on the brink of domestic and financial disaster." She left school at 13 to work. At 15, she was a chorus girl in a speakeasy. At 16, she was dancing in the Ziegfeld Follies. A Broadway producer saw her perform and gave her a role in a play called The Noose. He also gave her a new name. Ruby Stevens became Barbara Stanwyck in 1926. She was 19 years old. She walked onto a Broadway stage with a new identity and the specific kind of determination that is produced not by confidence, but by the total absence of any alternative. She had come from nothing, from foster homes and kitchen floors, and a father who had simply walked away. She was not going back. By the late 1920s, Barbara Stanwyck was in Hollywood. Frank Capra directed her in Ladies of Leisure in 1930 and told anyone who would listen that she was something entirely new, a naturalistic actress in an era when most screen performance was still shaped by the conventions of the stage, a woman who made you believe she was living the scene rather than performing it. He was not alone in the assessment. By her late 20s, Barbara Stanwyck was established as one of the most respected actresses in the industry. She had also married Frank Fay. Frank Fay was a Broadway comedian who had been significantly more famous than Barbara Stanwyck when they met in 1928. He was charming, talented, funny, and by multiple accounts, a difficult man made more difficult by the specific combination of alcoholism, jealousy, and the gathering awareness that his career was declining as hers was rising. He drank, he was possessive, he was physically abusive in the way that physically abusive men in 1930s Hollywood were handled, which is to say, quietly and within the walls of the marriage, the studio system providing cover for its assets, and looking away from what happened in their private lives. Barbara Stanwyck had grown up, knowing that the world was not safe and that love was not permanent. She had learned that at 4 years old. What she wanted from Frank Fay, more than anything, was something that proved the lesson wrong. A family, a home, a life that held. The marriage was not going to provide it. She could feel the marriage failing around her. In December 1932, she and Frank Fay adopted a 10-month-old baby boy. His birth name was John Charles Green. His biological mother had given him up as an infant. He was renamed Anthony Dion Fay, Dion for short. The honest record of why Barbara Stanwyck adopted that baby is uncomfortable to read. She did not adopt him because she had always wanted to be a mother. She adopted him because she hoped, with the logic of someone desperate to save something that was already lost, that a child might hold the marriage together. It was a reason that made a kind of terrible human sense. And it was a reason that set Dion's entire life in motion on a foundation that was already cracked before he arrived. The marriage did not survive the adoption. Frank Fay's drinking worsened. The violence continued. Barbara Stanwyck had grown up fending for herself, and she was not a woman who submitted easily to anyone's authority. But she was also a woman who had spent her childhood learning that the people who were supposed to protect you left. She stayed longer than she should have. The moment that ended it is documented in court records and in Frank Fay's own later behavior. During one of his drunk rages, Frank Fay picked up the toddler Dion, his adopted son, a small child who had already been abandoned once by his biological mother, and threw him into the swimming pool. Dion was rescued. He was not physically injured, but the act itself was the act of a man who was beyond reach, and Barbara Stanwyck finally reached the place she could not come back from. She filed for divorce in 1935. She fought for custody of Dion and won. Frank Fay's career continued to decline. Barbara Stanwyck became the highest-paid woman in the United States in 1944. A Star is Born, the 1937 film about a woman's career rising as her husband's falls, was widely understood to be modeled on their marriage. And Dion came to live with his mother alone. The child who had been adopted to save a marriage now existed in the aftermath of the divorce that the marriage had produced anyway. He was 3 years old. He had already been thrown into a swimming pool by one parent. The other parent, the one he had been left with, had adopted him for reasons that had nothing to do with loving him. He was 3 years old, and the accounting of the adults in his life was already, by any measure, dismal. Barbara Stanwyck raised Dion the way she knew how to raise someone, which is to say, the way she had been raised, without softness, without patience for weakness, with the absolute conviction that the world did not accommodate people who were not tough enough to meet it. She had survived a childhood that would have broken most people by becoming harder. She expected her son to be hard. When he turned out to be a boy who struggled in school, who was a little overweight, who got into trouble and needed guidance rather than discipline, she did not know how to reach him. She also looked at him and saw Frank Fay. Dion had his adoptive father's physicality, his manner, something in his bearing that reminded her of the man she had fought so hard to escape. It was not Dion's fault. He was a child. But Barbara Stanwyck had not had the kind of childhood that teaches you how to separate the person in front of you from the feelings they trigger in you. She pulled away. She sent him to boarding schools. When he was 12 years old and injured at summer camp, seriously enough that he was hospitalized, doctors called his mother. She did not come. She did not call back. He lay in the hospital without her. When he was 19, the estrangement became permanent. Dion reached out to his uncle, Barbara's brother, and asked if he could see his mother. His uncle's response was delivered flatly, without softening. Forget it. Forget that Barbara Stanwyck is your mother. She wants nothing to do with you. Dion was 19 years old. He had already been abandoned by his biological mother at birth. He had been thrown into a swimming pool by his adoptive father, and now his adoptive mother had issued the instruction through an intermediary that he was to forget she existed. He did not forget. He could not. Barbara Stanwyck continued making films. She made Double Indemnity with Billy Wilder and was nominated for an Academy Award. She made Stella Dallas, the story of a working-class mother who sacrifices everything for her daughter and gave one of the most devastating performances of her era. Audiences wept at her on-screen motherhood. Dion lived quietly, far from Hollywood, working ordinary jobs, living privately, largely unknown. In the 1950s, he was arrested for attempting to sell obscene photographs. The incident appeared in the papers briefly, a reminder that Barbara Stanwyck's son still existed, though his mother behaved in every public context as though he did not. When she received an honorary Academy Award in 1982, the industry's acknowledgement of a career that had never been adequately recognized with a competitive Oscar, she stood at the podium and thanked her colleagues. She thanked directors and co-stars in the industry that had given her a life she could not have imagined from those Brooklyn kitchen floors. She did not mention her son. In tabloid interviews through the 1980s, Dion described himself with a word that stayed with the journalists who heard it. He said he had been thrown away. Barbara Stanwyck, when Dion's name came up in interviews, dismissed the subject quickly. She described him as long gone. She once told a reporter with the specific coldness of someone who has decided not to feel, "Some children are born with bad blood, just like horses." Her son was not a horse. He was a man who had been abandoned twice before he was old enough to understand what abandonment meant, and who had spent the decades since in the specific grief of someone who cannot stop hoping that the person who left them will eventually come back. Barbara Stanwyck died on January 20th, 1990, in Santa Monica, California. She had requested, explicitly, in instructions left with the people around her, that there be no funeral, no memorial service. She did not want ceremony. She also left a second instruction. She did not want Anthony Dion Fay to be allowed to see her. Not as she was dying, not after she was gone. The instruction was absolute. Her son was not to come. He had always held out hope. Even after decades of silence, even after his uncle's message, even after the honorary Oscar speech where she did not say his name, he had held on to the possibility that at the end, at the very end, she might want to see him. The instruction closed that door. Anthony Dion Fay died on May 17, 2006, in Van Nuys, California. He was 74 years old. The cause of his death was never publicly reported. His passing went unannounced. There were no obituaries in the newspapers that had once covered his mother's every move. He died as he had lived, quietly, privately, in the margins of a story whose center had always been someone else. Barbara Stanwyck had left the bulk of her estate to her charitable foundation. She left nothing to her son. Barbara Stanwyck was 4 years old when her mother died and her father walked away. She spent the rest of her life becoming someone that nothing could touch. She worked harder than anyone around her. She became the highest paid woman in America. She played mothers on screen, sacrificing, devoted, aching mothers with a conviction that made audiences believe she knew exactly what that love felt like. Maybe she did know. Maybe that was exactly the problem. She had spent her childhood desperately wanting what Dion desperately wanted from her. She knew the specific weight of it, and she could not give it. A film critic once wrote that Dion and his mother had one important thing in common. Both of them were effectively orphans. It is the saddest sentence in Hollywood history. Because it is true, and because she had the power to make it untrue, and she chose not to. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more lives like these, the extraordinary people who shaped Hollywood, and the quieter lives they left behind.